Greetings, friends of liberty. Although we can find no end of good ideas in the world as we see it today, it is also true that there are no end of silly ones floating around in our cultural cosmos. God knows that the Christians themselves are responsible for so very many of them, one of their silliest ideas being that of the philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Jawohl. Now, Leibniz is justifiably famous for being one of the discoverers of the calculus, and yet this man, so brilliant in one respect, falls down flat on his Teutonic face in another. Good in one area, bad in the other. It is very common amongst the Christians. And what did Leibniz say that was so dim-witted? He said, and I quote, that we live in the best of all possible worlds. The best. Now, one of the best responses to Leibniz's inanity was formulated by the inimitable Voltaire, who famously mocked it in his novel Candide in 1759. And why did Voltaire mock Leibniz and his idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds? Because 4 years earlier, the extraordinarily destructive Lisbon earthquake of 1755 had brought down huge swaths of buildings, killing thousands, A. B, created a large wave which inundated the harbor, and even some of the city areas as well, killing even more people and destroying more buildings. C, created fires, and an enormous firestorm, which killed thousands more and destroyed many buildings as well, with over 85% of Lisbon's architecture destroyed, including virtually all of its churches. Was God perhaps sending a message of his dissatisfaction with the quality of the churchly services held therein? D, in all, tens of thousands were killed by violent tremor, conflagration, and flood, and the entire city left homeless, the dear Lord being very thorough in using all manner of available destruction in his annihilation. Is this, indeed, the best of all possible worlds, Herr Leibniz? Now if we turn to other potentially dim-witted ideas and dim hypotheses in your own 21st century in America and the West, we examine today objectivist philosopher Leonard Peikoff's The Dim Hypothesis, Why the Lights of the West Are Going Out. In this, Peikoff proposes that the fundamental foundational reason why Western civilization is experiencing the difficulties it has and may even be destroyed is because of the faulty philosophical premises and methods that we in the West have been using now for over 2 centuries. These, Peikoff suggests, unless promptly corrected, will likely doom us all. The lights of the West, in contrast to their now being brightly lit as from space, we can see at night, if we look at the country of South Korea, will go out, rendering us civilizationally just as dark as North Korea at night looks from space today. Peikoff begins by pointing to what he believes is the reason for this potentially catastrophic failure. The fall of Western civilization, if it does fall, can be traced to its beginning. I do not mean that its beginning led to its end. I mean the opposite. Our rejection of our beginning is what is killing us. What can he possibly mean by this? He means the rejection of the civilizationally essential knowledge first discovered by Greek philosophers, our beginning. He says of pioneering pre-Socratic philosopher Thales, Thales was the first man in recorded history to face the bewildering diversity of material objects and ask, do they all have something in common? And the importance of asking this question was that Thales was trying to integrate everything that we see into one common principle that would make sense of or explain it all. This focus on integration is of crucial importance if we human beings are to succeed in making sense and dealing effectively with the world around us. So if, for example, we were to recognize that men on average are physically stronger and bigger than women, pound for pound, this truth allows us to understand the behavior of men and women in society better, to integrate many individual instances. The Greeks, Peikoff says, formulated this desire for integration by asking, what is the one in the many? A question they soon pursued in a wide variety of areas unknown to Thales or Socrates. So Aristotle recognized, for example, that the vast majority of fishes can be broken down into two categories: the cartilaginous, like sharks, and the bony, like tuna. Recognizing these facts, we can now make sense of all fishes much better. We can integrate the many into the one, or in this case, two. Incidentally, the I in the acronym DIM stands exactly for integration. Induction, of course, is the exact process of getting lots of specific examples to see what they might have in common. And the more knowledge we get, the more we can integrate. So as Peikoff says, for the ancients, mathematics and physics were treated largely as unrelated. Now, thanks mainly to Newton, we speak only of mathematical physics. So here the integration is so vast that it encompasses two whole sciences, merging them together. And that is enormously valuable. Given that the I, integration, is an ideal way of approaching the world intellectually, and given that we indeed form our concepts of the world precisely with this method, it is important to ask what other possibilities are there. In which ways can the I go wrong? Peikoff proposes two fundamentally fallacious alternatives. First, someone can integrate things falsely, which he calls misintegration, the M in the acronym DIM. Secondly, one can simply fail or refuse to integrate at all. This he calls disintegration, the D in DIM. What would be a direct example and illustration of these three principles? In painting, the example of Vermeer integrating compositional elements together realistically and logically would be I, integrative. The example of Salvador Dali's surrealism would be M, misintegration, trying to integrate things that don't go together. And finally, the example of the modernist Jackson Pollock and his random smears of color on a canvas would be regarded as disintegrative, or a D. Peikoff now uses this understanding and this threefold categorization to proceed to analyze the history of Western philosophy itself, starting by saying that the greatest philosophers of the West, the big three, I will call them, are Plato, 427 to 347 BC, Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, and Kant, 1724 to 1804. Let's see how he reviews each, starting with Plato. Number one, for Plato, there's essentially one God or universal spirit that encompasses everything, and that being is the true superior reality, which means that the many things we see in the world around us are less real than God, inferior. The many philosophers who championed Plato, such as Christian theologian Augustine and the German philosopher Hegel, regarded various elements of this Platonic God as ruling the world. Platonists believe in rationalism, which is the theory that conceptualization is the essence of human cognition, but that concepts cannot be derived from the senses. The true base of knowledge in this view is the a priori, that is, concepts independent of percepts. In a very general psychological sense, rationalists are thus people who have their own fixed ideas about the world and refuse to let the evidence staring them in the face change their mind. Although Peikoff believes that Plato is a master of philosophy and a world-class integrator, he also argues that Plato's method of integration is the archetype of invalid integration, misintegration. It rejects one element of validity, the senses, and thus detaches from nature the other two logic, and concepts. Next up, philosopher number 2, Aristotle. For the secular Aristotle, in contrast to Plato, there is no matter without form and no form without matter. The two are inseparable. Form is not a transcendent reality, but one of an entity's two worldly elements. In contrast to Plato, Aristotle believes that at birth the mind is empty and man must derive all his knowledge from sensory data. To move beyond such data, man must use his faculty of abstraction. So in the dim categorization, Aristotle represents integration done correctly. We use our perceptions and integrate many of them together inductively to form concepts. Finally, philosopher number 3, Immanuel Kant. The Objectivists and Ayn Rand are famous for their literal claim that Kant is the most evil man in mankind's history. As Google AI says, Rand's assessment of Kant is a source of controversy and is not shared by most Kant scholars. But this objectivist belief logically follows for objectivists, since they believe that individual philosophers A, determine the direction and fate of civilizations, and B, that Kant has sent Western civilization down the wrong civilizational path deliberately. Thus, Kant in their eyes is far worse than Hitler. Peikoff portrays Kant as believing that the human mind is furnished innately with 12 a priori concepts or categories. These are not ideas in the traditional sense. They are mental machinery, processing mechanisms that transform the raw data from reality before these data reach our consciousness. In other words, Peikoff argues that Kant believes that our minds will automatically process what we see and hear around us in a way that distorts it, so that we can never really understand reality as it is, only as our minds misperceive and misprocess what we see and hear. Peikoff thus believes that Kant is falsely but fundamentally undercutting our ability to know the world around us, destroying all attempts at human knowledge. And thus, for this reason, Peikoff calls Kant a nihilist, the first and greatest nihilist in the history of thought, one who works to destroy man's mind and values as an end in itself. And thus, Kant earns the D in our acronym DIM, disintegrative. Kant disintegrates. Kantians in modern times include educator Thomas Dewey and philosophers Hegel, Schopenhauer, and John Rawls. Concluding Peikoff's presentation of what he calls the Big Three, let's note some refinements to his theory. Number 1. Since objectivists believe that philosophers determine the primary course of civilizations, Peikoff believes that Western civilization can be divided into 3 periods: a Platonic era from the Hellenistic centuries through the Middle Ages, an Aristotelian era from the Renaissance through the Enlightenment, and a Kantian era for the past 2 centuries. Number 2, Peikoff calls later Platonists like Descartes and Spinoza worldly supernaturalists because, while being Platonists, they still let in more of the real world and thus science than Plato did. On the other hand, he calls scientists like Auguste Comte and others positivists, knowing skeptics, because they represented a mutation of empiricism in the face of Kant, but still to a degree believed in the process of science. Number 3, aside from the 3 categories or modes, D, I, and M, Peikoff now divides both D and M into 2 subcategories, D1 and D2 and M1 and M2. The D2 and M2 standing for the more intense, pure, and thus the worst of these modes. The M1 and D1 are mixed with others. So according to Peikoff, Descartes was an M1 philosopher and Comte a D1. Having now in part 1 identified his 3 different modes with 2 additional subcategories, Peikoff now in parts 2 and 3 uses these 5 types to analyze different periods in Western civilization. He believes by using these modes we can identify the modal nature of each period of the West, whether it's D, I, M, or some combo, by surveying its cultural products, things like its scientific discoveries, great artistic works, and ideas in politics and philosophy. Let's watch him as he does this. Part 2, Dim in Modern Culture. Example number 1. Classicism in the arts, here in drama, is exemplified by the French classical playwrights Racine and Corneille of the 17th century. Here there is some good, like plenty of local and societal color and incorporation of the real world into the plays, and some bad, since the playwrights follow the same stereotype rules, like that everything must occur in 24 hours and in one place, which makes it hard for the viewers to understand the characters and the meaning of the events. So for Peikoff, classicism in the various arts exemplifies a mixture of Plato and Aristotle, and thus the mixed mode M1. Example number 2, Romanticism. Romanticism in literature is a consistently Aristotelian approach, which, as he argues, rejected authority and aesthetics in favor of the independent judgment of the artist. The hero is intoxicated by his own goals. He is defined by his wholehearted use of his faculties to gain and keep what he desires, and their values revealed primarily by their actions. The classification, I. The naturalists, on the other hand, exemplified by writers like Sinclair Lewis and Leo Tolstoy, gave up on heroism, simply copying real life as they saw it, not highlighting the essence of a character and including irrelevant details hard to integrate. The classification, D1. Example number 3, Modernism. The modernists, as a movement, are understandably regarded by our author as the worst of the worst, he highlighting their artistic portrayals of extreme irrationality and immorality, exemplified by writers like Franz Kafka, Thomas Mann in his novel The Magic Mountain, and James Joyce's Ulysses. Classification, highly disintegrative, D2. Example number 4, turning to the sciences, and specifically physics. Here Peikoff naturally contrasts René Descartes, who mixed a dash of a priori deductive theorizing with a dollop of observation of the real world, earning him a mixed mode M1, with a highly inductive method of Isaac Newton, combining experimentation with mathematics, and thus powerfully integrative and explanatory, earning him an I, with Immanuel Kant, who said, natural science will never reveal to us the internal constitution of things, D2. And finally, with Einstein, like Newton, another champion of integration, always looking for fundamental principles expressed in the widest abstractions. Einstein's last quest was to discover a unified field theory integrating all physical phenomena into one ultimate equation. Peikoff adds a lengthy description of the seeming irrationality of much of modern physics, calling that highly misintegrative, so M2. Let's skip his section on modern politics and education and head straight to part 3, Dim in Pre-Modern Culture, seeing again what he regards as distinctive cultural products. Example number 1, ancient Greece. Naturally here, Peikoff praises Greek culture at length, for example, for its love of Homer, for its democracy, for its relatively dismissive attitude towards the gods, who often functioned as comic relief in their literature, for the relative secularism of their science, as exemplified by the physician Hippocrates, for the freedom and secularity in their education, which produced magnificent results. Example number 2, ancient Rome. Here Peikoff focuses on the ways in which he believes Roman civilization was worse than the Greek, in its greater religiosity, and in its imagining the Roman gods were more powerful and interfering than the Greek, in its emphasis on the greater duty of the citizen to obey and support the state, in the worldly supernaturalism of the Stoics, and on the Roman near obsession with the study and teaching of rhetoric and grammar. Roman civilization, because somewhat misintegrative and more supernatural, gets an M1. Finally, example number 3, medieval Europe. Here, of course, we see, despite the existence of rebellions or reasonable exceptions, like theologians Peter Abelard and Thomas Aquinas, the dominance of Christianity, which Peikoff outlines and describes in many different ways. This period of high religiosity gets an M2. Let's now turn to the fourth and final part, part 4, Peikoff predicting the future. As we've seen, he regards the modes as highly determinative. So Western civilization in this understanding, going from the Greeks to the Romans to the Dark Ages. He also believes that what might trigger a modal changeover is impossible to predict in the short term. He says, the rise and fall of any mode can be understood only in conjunction with a specific triggering event or events. That is, events which, in the context of the period, lead people to question and to conclude that the established mode is unsafe, backward, invalid, or evil. Triggers are sometimes datable events. More commonly, they are conditions that have developed and intensified across time. So looking into his objectivist crystal ball, what does Dr. Peikoff predict? Well, when the Greeks allegedly lapsed into M1 from I, he argues that this was because they hadn't completely expunged the remnants of their previous religious beliefs, which of course were misintegrative. And that's exactly the same dynamic, according to Dr. Peikoff, that is likely happening to us, or at least the US today, causing a resurgence of religious belief by the new Christian right, which he believes will likely bring the edifice of Western civilization crashing right down on top of our heads. Because we too haven't, like the Greeks, apparently completely expunged religious belief from our previous belief system. As Peikoff says, the Enlightenment eyes left their rival in waiting with the potential for a much stronger comeback. As it turned out, however, the potential in this case took quite a while to be actualized. And the trigger that actualized the revival of the M mode? Kant. The appearance of Kant's critical philosophy, soon widely accepted by thinkers as the definitive solution to the intellectual problem of the ages. Dr. Peikoff additionally believes that the progressive period in the US, arriving at the beginning of the 20th century approximately, was a symptom of D2 coming into societal prominence. Peikoff believes that D2 in American politics has to contend with a unique obstacle, the legacy of the Founding Fathers, and that there may be a glimmer of hope, and it may actually be integrative, while looking anti-integrative. So while on the one hand, the main evidence for this is the long-term split between the intellectuals and the common-sense-oriented U.S. public, on the other hand, this I mentality appears to him to be receding into the past, since the public for decades now has continued to move in an anti-I direction. Uh-oh. The greatest danger, however, Peikoff believes, will come not from the secularists, the D1s and 2s, but instead the believers in religion, the M2s. He says, religion was once on the defensive in the face of a proudly self-assertive science. The opposite now seems to be true. This judgment is derived from his own modal snapshot taken in 2009-10, the conclusions drawn being that the most prominent representatives of the M2 mentality, the largest, most articulate, and most militant groups are to be found among the fundamentalists, the evangelicals, the Pentecostals, and in general the born-agains. We may call these the new Christians. What proof does he adduce of this? As usual, cultural products. Some of the more well-known, including the Left Behind series of Tim LaHaye, a popularization of biblical tales full of bloodthirsty vengeance against unbelievers, and the soaring sales to teenagers of Christian music. Poll results show that 46% of Americans believe that they would ascend to heaven if the rapture occurred. Peikoff is also afraid that homeschooling will increase the number of the religious, and that since politics is the last area to yield to modal change, Sooner or later, all these new Christians will appear in force politically. The end result? Religious totalitarianism in America. That is my prediction. By its nature, the M2 mind will reinterpret Americanism. Patriotism would likely become nationalism, individualism, collectivism, and liberty, pious obedience. Which certainly accords to a degree with what we see from MAGA today. Is there any hope for the West at all then, Dr. Peikoff? He says the only way to uproot a philosophy is to replace it with another. In the present case, to replace both errors, M and D, with some form of Aristotle. His final words? I do not write my final book as Cassandra, preaching resignation before the apocalypse. The high probability of a monstrous evil should not induce paralysis in those who see it coming. And so there we have it. The happy dim hypothesis, as argued by its originator, who predicts that the civilizational dark forces will quite probably, at some point in the next half century, overwhelm us all. Let's turn now to evaluating this book and Peikoff's theory, warming up first with 8 minor and then 4 major criticisms. Minor criticism number 1. Dr. Peikoff says materialists, just as much as idealists, are not secular at all, but rather are supernaturalists, and thus essentially akin to religionists. No, while materialists have an ideology, they are obviously not supernaturalists, and people who believe in the supernatural believe in the primacy of consciousness. Ghosts, for example, with no material substance. But materialists definitively deny that consciousness exists. So here Peikoff is confused in thinking that if you have an ideology, you must believe in the supernatural. That is false. Minor criticism number 2. Dr. Peikoff says, Aristotle appeals to joyful realism on earth, Kant appeals to rage. No, whatever Kant believed, he didn't promote it and doesn't induce rage. Philosophers who do are Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, or Euston Stewart Chamberlain, not Kant, who is significantly a product of the Enlightenment. Minor criticism number 3. Peikoff claims 19th century Romantic literature and ancient Greek literature expressed the same disdain for religion. But as David Gordon points out in an online review of this book, this is arguable since you can find romantics such as William Blake and William Wordsworth who were essentially Christians. Minor criticism number 4. Peikoff says, the concept of disintegration does not apply to the countless people today who are merely non-integrators and know nothing about the issues of epistemology. I suspect that this is false. If you psychologically make it a habit not to integrate, then whatever the reasons are, you are D, or at least non-integrative, which seems the same thing. Minor criticism number 5. Peikoff exempts industrial and material production from his cultural products analysis. He justifies this by saying, as Ayn Rand has demonstrated, industrialists are men of the mind who produce wealth primarily by a process of reason and who therefore are guided, at least implicitly, by the teachings of Aristotle. But I think if we look at the future production in how well societies innovate, societies that are freer innovate much more productively than societies that aren't free. In any case, if he's right and societies can continue to improve industrially and materially all the time, no matter what their dim mode, how then can he predict the West likely is doomed to complete failure and collapse? Minor criticism number 6. When Dr. Peikoff examines the whole nature of modern physics, arguing how nonsensical it is, he's completely oblivious to how much modern physics is supported by the state. Does he not think that that makes a difference? Minor criticism number 7. When Dr. Peikoff says the medieval church not only exemplified totalitarianism, it invented the system, this is not exactly true since A, the Spartans had a pretty totalitarian state themselves, as B did King Li in 9th century BC China, and C, the Qin dynasty in the 4th century BC. Minor criticism number 8. He claims that Shakespeare's work as a whole is outside of dim classification, which is absurd since everything should be able to be classified by dim, which covers all logical possibilities. Minor criticism, finally, number 9. He appears to think rock music leads to irrationality, mentioning our inarticulate, rock-blasted teenagers. I can only say that some of the most rational people I know like rock music. This is a typical example of orthodox objectivists seeing the modern world in the worst possible light. Let's now finally turn to my major criticisms. Major criticism number 1. The fundamental and fatal flaw of Dr. Peikoff's theory is that it ignores the role of violence and coercion in influencing the development and formation of the belief systems whose rise and fall he is at such pains to explain. It is exceedingly obvious that throughout many millennia, the failure, for example, of church and state to separate themselves has, in dozens of instances, propped up and maintained major religious ideologies like Catholicism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Shinto, to name just a few, that otherwise would have been significantly weaker to start with or would have failed much sooner. What does Dr. Peikoff say about all this? He refers to this crucial issue in only one instance, saying, the church did make limited use of military force, mostly through temporary alliance with a friendly king, but this tactic was not of much significance. In essence, the church conquered the West not by physical, but by spiritual means, that is, by the power of its ideas over men's minds and souls. I must confess that this is one of the more abysmally ignorant statements I've ever heard an objectivist make. The entire history of the growth of Catholic Christianity is an almost prototypical example of the use of violence. If, for example, we simply read the works of Catherine Nixie, whose The Darkening Age I reviewed here, or Peter Heather's Christendom, we see the hundreds of ways that Christian belief was promoted and maintained by the violence and coercion of the state, the Christian church and state working together. So when Dr. Peikoff asks by what means do these abstractions gain and exercise their power over people, it is obviously in part through violent means and methods. Shall we not review just a few? A, the Christian monks, called parabolani, the brown shirts of early Christianity, who from the 4th century on emerged from both city and countryside to destroy pagan temples, most notably the famous Serapeum in Alexandria in 391, or when they weren't pulling down buildings and defacing statues, murdering Christians like the philosopher Hypatia in 415. Few of these crimes, or the thousands of others, were punished, meaning the pagans knew very well that paganism was doomed to physical destruction. That is disintegrative. B, as Peter Heather documents at length, in Christendom, once the Roman emperors became Christian, their patronage and favor flowed much more to Christian bureaucrats, politicians, and followers than pagan. This was likely why around 5% of the Roman Empire was Christian in 300 AD, and probably 50% was a century later in 400. So in many ways, the emperors simply used the taxing power of the empire to collect money from everyone, then give it to those who became or acted Christian, in essence, bribing and incentivizing their conversion. Then all Roman elites could see which way the religious winds were blowing and mostly became Christian, as they did in much of the eastern parts of the empire when Islam arrived. Same process. C, and do I really have to explicitly name all the many other instances of Catholic persecution? The laws promulgated by successive Roman emperors outlawing, punishing, and fining
pagan belief and practice, as found in the Theodosian Codes in 438, the slaughter by Charlemagne of 4,500 Saxons who wouldn't convert, the burning of heretics and destruction of entire heretical towns, the later French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Roman Inquisitions, the 30 Years' War of religion destroying Germany, the indulgences, the invasions and forcible conversion in other countries like the Baltics, all of Latin America, and at times during the Crusades. Did none of these influence the maintenance and prevalence of Christian belief, Dr. Peikoff? Major mistake number 2. If it is true that violence throughout history protects ideologies, then it must also be true that the opposite of violence, the protection of property rights, is a foundational aspect of civilizational progress. What is the nature of this feeling? I would argue that a moral sense with regard to the protection of property is found very early on in babies. Studies show that even before a year old, they typically express disapproval, not only if you take something that is theirs, but if they see someone stealing from another baby. All this shows how deeply ingrained this moral sense is in human beings. That makes it civilizationally a separate force from Peikoff's dim forces in society. The ancient Teutons and Germans were reputed to be relatively democratic and to have an inclination to protect property rights, which the Anglo-Saxons then likely brought to England. Was this because the members of these tribes had studied Aristotle's prior and posterior analytics, Dr. Peikoff? And speaking of Aristotle, what do we find when we look at the city of Athens? That the Athenians protected the property rights of their citizens as much or more than any region in Greece. You can read all about it in Richard Pipes' Property and Freedom. That emphasis on protecting property rights meant that A, the society would be successful, and B, create the very social and economic environment so that philosophers like Aristotle and Plato could emerge and flourish, which would have been unthinkable down the Peloponnese and Sparta, which didn't protect property rights. In other words, respecting property rights maximizes the production of knowledge, among which good philosophies like Aristotle's are one part. So when Dr. Peikoff says, since virtually nothing is known about the cause of the I mode's first rise in Greece, that's flatly false. What caused the rise of Athenian philosophy was, at least in part, the fact that the Athenians protected and valued property rights so consistently for their time. Major criticism number 3. So if we now look at all A, the ways in which force influences the rise of all self-deceptive belief systems, in other words, all ideologies, both secular and religious, and B, we also look at the ways that protecting rights results in the rise of good belief systems, producing knowledge, then we can see, for example, that A, the spread of communism in Russia, which belief was estimated at 3% of the population before the revolution, was not caused by dim forces, but primarily the violence of the Soviet state. Dr. Peikoff doesn't seem to realize that most people will choose being or acting communist over a spell in the gulag. It has nothing to do with their alleged misintegration. So when he says Lenin illustrated the group that follows an innovator may grow exponentially, that's largely false. The growth in communism in Russia was likely mainly caused by pure coercion. B, Dr. Peikoff claims that Newton, in and of himself, caused the Enlightenment. He says Newton's cultural power was his demonstration, unprecedented in the modern world, of the power of Aristotle, that is, of the secular thinking mind. In other words, everyone saw and was inspired by the method used and the achievement that Newton created using induction and mathematics. What this again utterly ignores is that A, Newton by his contemporaries was regarded as breaking away from Aristotle's scholasticism. B, that Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo also inspired everyone. A little pat on the back here would have been nice there, Leonard. And C, that Newton lived in Protestant England. Why was that important? Number one, England was a relatively free country, and so it's not surprising, just like Aristotle and Plato emerged in free Athens, so too Newton in relatively free England. Number two, England was Protestant, and Protestant countries and ethnic groups overwhelmingly are more successful scientifically than Catholic. And why was that? Because the Reformation freed the Protestant countries from all the coercive obstacles that the Catholic Church had put in the way of Catholic scientists. Peikoff, thinking only modes matter and not freedom, remains oblivious to this fact, only mentioning the Reformation one time in the entire book in the notes. What are some examples of this higher Protestant productivity? Among others, the scientific performance of Catholic Americans, both Irish and Italian, versus Protestants. So if we take, for example, the period from 1900 to 1972, by my rough calculation, Irish Americans won Nobel Prizes at 0.05 per million, having won one with 20 million people by 1972. Italian Americans during this period won 3, having a ratio of 0.15 million, and Protestants won Nobels at 2.2 per million, so being over 40 times more productive than Irish Americans and almost 15 times more than Italian Americans. Of course, the Jews during this period won 26 Nobels, so with 6 million people approximately, so that results in 4.33 Nobels per million, they being almost twice as productive as the Prots. Major criticism number 4. A. Because Peikoff doesn't understand the role of violence in creating ideologies, he appears here completely ignorant of the fact that the vast increase in public coercive funding and control of both lower and higher education in the West has created many ideologies. The very ideologies that he points out are so destructive. Although he does at one point say the D1 mentality, it would appear, is formed primarily in college, he also appears to think that American education is politically neutral, saying the majority of our teachers are not ideologically trained and in fact insist that they deliberately avoid proselytizing. But the reality is that higher education since the 1960s has become overwhelmingly liberal, with numerous disciplines composed 90+% of liberals, and lower education likely is, at least to a degree as well. None of this would have happened without the extensive state support and control of education since World War II. B. Similarly, he applauds using phonics to teach reading, but doesn't understand that public schools are much more likely to try to teach reading without phonics, like the American pioneer of public education, Horace Mann, did from the 1840s on. Instead, Peikoff attributes the decline in the use of phonics to Kant, instead of its actual cause, the great monopoly that public schools possess. How many homeschoolers teach the whole word method, Dr. Peikoff? C, when he analyzes Roman education, he similarly ignores, as Andrew Coulson points out at length in his Market Education, The Unknown History, that the state interfered enormously in Roman education, rewarding loyalty to state doctrines, and that the teachers were often bored slaves. This goes a long way to explaining why it was worse than Greek education, which was consistently free market. So now we come to my conclusion. Firstly, what Peikoff has tried to do here is create a social theory of everything, attempting an epic feat of societal integration. But theories of everything are notoriously difficult to assemble, as physicist Sabine Hassenfelder, among others, has pointed out, because you have to actually include everything. But Peikoff has left out a huge element in the formation of ideologies: violence. And so in the same way that materialism as a theory of everything badly fails because it only explains the actions of inanimate objects, ignoring all living and conscious beings, so too Peikoff fails catastrophically. And ironically too, since the very rationalistic approach that he so often accuses others of using, having an a priori conception of the world and then ignoring the evidence of the senses, is precisely the error he commits here. ignoring the evidence of the senses, staring him straight in the face throughout millennia of human history. Secondly, he wants us to believe that philosophy is the master control knob affecting the entire course of civilizations, implying that other causes only play a minor role. He says the West's historical progression occurs in substantial part because of the logic of modal progression. Of course, it has to be very substantial if the lights of the West are allegedly going out. But is this true? Is philosophy the master control knob? No. First, as I mentioned before, he admits that material and industrial progress can continue despite a civilization being in a bad modal state. Secondly, all of human history up to the Greeks was an advance that occurred without any obvious philosophy. Progress occurred. Similarly, since the 1870s, when he says our Kantian phase began, Western civilization's standard of living has still increased substantially. Which means, I would argue, that while philosophical knowledge is certainly important, it is only one of many areas and disciplines of knowledge. And thus, while we can certainly say that philosophy is the queen of the sciences, and that it would be optimal if the West's philosophical base was consistently Aristotelian, it's also likely true that some progress can still be made nonetheless, as we've been making. Happy for my part that England has had, in its history, one of the greatest political philosophers to have ever lived, John Locke, who has again and again demonstrated the enormous and foundational civilizational value of protecting property rights. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.